A scroll unrolls on a heavy wooden reading table. The parchment is thick, cured animal skin, carrying the scent of old dust and bitter olive oil. But if you look closer at the actual text they are skipping, at the exact words burned into that parchment, the blood dries on the rough wood. He is placed in a rich man's tomb, exactly as Isaiah predicted. A man who had done no violence. A man whose mouth contained no deceit. The heavy stone rolls across the entrance. The guards take their positions. The physical life of the servant ends in the dark. But the detail that changes how you read the cross is not what happens to his body. It is what the prophet says happens to his soul. The physical death of the servant was only the visible surface of a transaction happening in an entirely different realm. If you look closely at the second half of Isaiah chapter 53, verse 10, the prophet moves past the physical crushing. He looks directly at what the death actually accomplishes in the eyes of God. The English translation says, when his soul makes an offering for guilt. We read the phrase guilt offering and we think of it as a generic religious term, a sacrifice made to apologize for wrongdoing. But the word Isaiah uses here is the Hebrew asham. This is not a general word for worship. It is a highly specific legal and financial term, drawn straight from the ancient tabernacle system. In the book of Leviticus, the asham is known as the trespass offering. 700 years before a carpenter was dragged to a Roman execution site, you start to see something the academic reading completely misses. It is the specific protocol required when a person has committed fraud, stolen property, or desecrated holy things. The asham was not just a symbol of sorrow, it was a restitution payment. When an ancient Israelite brought an asham, they did not just bring an animal to bleed on the bronze altar. According to Leviticus chapter 5, they had to bring a flawless ram, and the priest had to calculate the exact financial value of the damage done, using the sanctuary shekel. The offender had to pay back the full value of what they took, plus a 20% penalty in heavy silver. You can almost hear the metal coins clinking onto the priest's measuring scales. You can smell the burning fat rising into the desert sky. The asham meant the ledger was balanced. The debt was wiped clean. When Isaiah takes this precise legal word and applies it to the soul of the suffering servant, the implication is staggering. The prophet is telling us that human rebellion is not just a moral mistake, it is a cosmic theft. We have defrauded the creator of the glory, the obedience, and the life that rightfully belonged to him. We have accumulated a debt so massive that no amount of human silver could ever tip the scales back into balance. This root word changes how you look at the crucifixion. His death is not a tragic martyrdom. It is a calculated restitution. This silence is not an oversight. It is a quarantine. The real question of Isaiah 53 isn't just, who is this man? It is this: the soul of the servant becomes the asham. He is the flawless ram. He is the silver on the scales. He absorbs the full penalty of the broken law, paying back a debt he did not owe. For a people who could not pay, the ledger is settled in blood. But this creates an impossible paradox in the text. If the servant is the offering, and the offering is slaughtered on a Roman cross, the story should end in the silence of a stone tomb. But Isaiah is not finished writing, and the very next verse describes an event that shatters the laws of human biology. The ground shakes in the dark outside Jerusalem. The Roman seal snaps. The heavy stone rolls back, grinding against the limestone track. The cold morning air rushes into a space that belongs to the dead. But the tomb is empty. The linen cloth, heavy with the bitter scent of myrrh and aloes, lies flat on the stone slab. It holds the shape of a man who is no longer there. Isaiah wrote this paradox into the parchment centuries before the stone was ever carved. In the exact same breath that the prophet describes the fatal guilt offering, he makes an impossible pivot. He writes, "He shall see his offspring." What is so terrifying about these 12 verses that they must be kept out of the public ear? He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. Look at the tension in the grammar. A dead man does not watch his family grow. A dead man does not prolong his days on the earth. A dead man does not look back at the anguish of his own violent execution and feel the deep, abiding satisfaction of a finished work. For generations, scholars stared at these contradictory verses and tried to spiritualize them. They assumed Isaiah was talking about a movement, a legacy, a philosophy that would survive after its founder was killed. This is not a poetic metaphor about a lingering memory. It is the literal heartbeat of a resurrected king. He breathes the cold morning air. He steps out of the tomb into the Judean dawn. He carries the violent scars of the Daka, the crushing in his wrists and his feet. But the execution is over. The asham is paid in full. The scales are perfectly balanced. And because the restitution is absolute, the Father does not leave his servant in the dust of the earth. God exalts him. Isaiah declares the outcome. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong. This is the language of a conquering general, standing over a defeated enemy. He poured out his soul to death. The answer to that question changes how you read every single prophecy in the Bible, because this chapter does not just predict a future event. He was numbered with the transgressors. He bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. The suffering servant was not defeated by the cross. He used the cross to purchase the very people who nailed him to it. But the prophet is not just telling you a story about an ancient victory. He is holding up a mirror to the reader, because the healing this servant buys is not applied to a human soul automatically. It demands something deeply uncomfortable from the person holding the scroll. We are a species obsessed with self-justification. In the modern world, when we fail, we immediately manage the fallout. We draft carefully worded apologies. We negotiate the penalty. When we read a text about a man pierced for our transgressions, our immediate instinct is to look for a way to minimize the damage. We want to believe our moral failures are just minor missteps, small errors in judgment that require a little bit of coaching or perhaps a few more hours of community service. We prefer a religion that hands us a clean checklist, not a blood-stained receipt. But the servant in Isaiah 53 does not offer advice. He offers a substitution. And to accept a substitution, you have to admit that you are completely incapable of saving yourself. It diagnoses a fundamental human blindness. It reveals exactly how the God of the universe chooses to enter human history. Look at the mechanics of healing in verse 5. The prophet writes, "Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed." The Hebrew word for wounds here is chabura. It refers specifically to the black and blue mark of a welt, the physical trauma left behind by a heavy blow. The prophet is telling us that our internal, spiritual peace was purchased through his external, physical trauma. You have to look at the crushing the Daka and acknowledge that the violence he endured is the exact measure of the debt you owed. You cannot hold on to your pride while simultaneously reaching for a pardon that cost the life of God himself. To accept the asham on the scales, you have to stand in the light and stop defending your own record. The cross is not a monument to human potential. It is the brutal, undeniable metric of human depravity and divine love. Operating at the exact same moment, we want a king who will hand us a sword and validate our strength. God sends a suffering servant who asks us to lay down our weapons and confess our absolute bankruptcy. This is exactly why the chapter is skipped. It is easier to turn the page in the synagogue. It is easier to blur the lines of the text than it is to look into the terrifying reflection it provides, and why our immediate instinct is to look the other way. These words were not written to start a new religion, because if the suffering servant is Jesus of Nazareth, then the long exile of humanity is finally over. The asham has been weighed on the scales. The debt is entirely canceled. But to walk into that freedom, you have to stop trying to pay for it yourself. And when you finally drop your own defense, the entire shape of the biblical story comes together in a single, deafening chord. A root pushed up from dry ground and became the tree of life. A man was crushed under the weight of heaven, and the debt of the world was canceled. A lamb stood silent before the shearers, and the accuser lost his voice entirely. A prisoner was pierced on Roman wood, and the wounds became a lasting cure. A soul was weighed as a trespass offering, and the ancient ledger was balanced in blood. A heavy stone rolled across a rich man's tomb, and the grave was stripped of its power. A rejected servant opened his eyes in the dawn, and the kingdom of heaven flooded with light. One thread, one story, but maybe the part that stays with me most is the silence. The skipped verses in the synagogue, the finger lifting off the parchment to bypass the pain, not just because it is a historical tragedy. They were written to a nation in exile, a people whose temples were smashed and whose children were carried off in chains, but because it is the exact mirror of the human heart. We all want to skip the slaughterhouse. We all want the gold crown without the crushing. We all want a king who validates our strength instead of a savior who exposes our absolute bankruptcy. If you are in a season where your own failures feel too heavy to carry, where the ledger of your life feels hopelessly unbalanced, and you are exhausted from trying to pay it off, Isaiah 53 is a place to sit. You do not have to defend your record anymore. You do not have to hide your spiritual poverty. The asham is already on the scales. The debt is finished. If this opens something up for you in the text, subscribe and leave a comment. Even one word helps. Share this with someone who is exhausted from trying to justify themselves. Pray for us as we keep digging into these ancient scrolls. And may the God who did not turn away from the dry ground walk with you through yours and heal you completely by the wounds he chose to bear. They were waiting for a warrior. They were waiting for a lion who would tear the empires of the world to pieces and put the crown back on the throne of David. But the prophet Isaiah did not give them a lion. He gave them a slaughterhouse. A reader traces his finger down the dense columns of Hebrew text. He reads the end of chapter 52. To understand why these verses are actively bypassed today, you have to look at the specific Hebrew words the prophet chose to write. You have to watch an ancient expectation collide with a reality that nobody wanted to see. The place to start is not at the cross. The place to start is in the dirt of a dry ground. The ancient world did not respect victims. If you lived in the ancient Near East, power was the only currency that mattered. When your city is surrounded by Babylonian siege ramps, when the smell of burning limestone fills the air and your neighbors are marched away in heavy iron chains, you do not pray for a philosopher. You do not pray for a martyr. You pray for a man with a sword. For centuries, the nation of Israel held fast to the promise of a coming king. They read the prophecies of David's throne being established forever. They looked for a royal conqueror who would finally break the yoke of the empires that kept crushing them. And by the time the first century arrived, with the cold edge of Roman steel pressing against their collective throats, that expectation had become a fever. They wanted a lion. But when rabbinic scholars unrolled the scroll of Isaiah, they hit a theological wall. The ancient words echo off the stone walls of the synagogue. He stops. The congregation sits in the dim light, listening, waiting for the rhythm to continue. Here, woven right into the center of the promises of redemption, is a completely different figure. He is called the servant, and he is not holding a weapon. He is taking a beating. The tension in the texts was so severe that later Jewish traditions actually developed a theory of two different messiahs just to make sense of the contradiction. They spoke of Messiah ben Joseph, a figure who would suffer and die, and Messiah ben David, the conquering king who would reign and rule. They had to split the prophecy in half because the human mind could not reconcile both realities existing in one body. Today, if you ask a traditional rabbi to explain this chapter, the standard answer is that the suffering servant is not a single person at all. They will tell you it represents the entire nation of Israel, suffering collectively at the hands of the Gentile nations. It is a creative explanation. It makes sense of the pain of the exile, but linguistically, the grammar of the Hebrew text refuses to allow it. The prophet repeatedly contrasts the singular he of the servant with the plural we of the people. He was pierced for our transgressions. The sufferer and the saved are two distinctly different parties. The text of Isaiah 53 is not a vague poetic metaphor, but he does not turn to the next column. He skips ahead. He begins reading chapter 54. This is not a mistake. It is a highly specific autopsy of a murder. The prophet uses vocabulary that belongs in a trauma ward, not a palace. He speaks of a man despised, rejected, a man of sorrows, who is intimately familiar with grief. For an occupied people looking for strength, this was the ultimate disappointment. If the Messiah is supposed to be the ultimate display of God's power, this chapter looks entirely like defeat. It describes a man stripped of all aesthetic appeal, devoid of any political leverage, entirely lacking the majesty that commands human respect. But Isaiah does not begin with the blood. He begins with the dirt. A green shoot pushes through parched dirt. The soil is cracked. The ground is baked like clay under a relentless sun. There is no water. There is no shade. A root forces its way up into the heat. It is twisted. It is stunted. It is rough to the touch. It is exactly the kind of plant a master gardener immediately tears out and throws into a fire. Isaiah writes, "He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground." Look at the imagery. Look at the immediate, visceral rejection. He has no form. He has no majesty. He has no beauty that we should desire him. It is a scheduled silence. In the traditional Jewish lectionary, the Haftarah reading cycle covers the prophets week by week. When ancient kings arrived, they arrived in gold. They arrived with polished armor catching the sunlight. They arrived with the sound of brass trumpets shaking the stone walls of the city. They commanded the eye. You could not look away. But this man arrives in the dust. You look at him, and you want to look away. Isaiah says, "We hid our faces from him. We despised him. We esteemed him not." This is not an accidental detail. It is a deliberate filter. God is stripping away every single external reason a human being might choose to follow this king. There is no wealth to attract the ambitious. There is no physical beauty to attract the shallow. There is no military might to attract the fearful. If you are going to follow this man, you have to follow him for something else entirely. He is a man of sorrows. He is acquainted with grief. The Hebrew word for grief here is choli. It means sickness. It means disease. He carries the posture of someone who has spent his entire life walking through a quarantine ward. He knows the weight of a shattered body. He knows the hollow stare of a grieving mother. He is rejected. But when it reaches the climax of Isaiah's scroll, it abruptly jumps. From Isaiah 52 to 12. It leaps over the next 15 verses, landing safely in Isaiah 54. He steps forward, and the crowd step back. He speaks, and the elite turn their heads. Men see him, and they cross the street. They spit on the cobblestones. They want nothing to do with the heavy, suffocating sadness that surrounds him. This is the anatomy of human rejection. We run from pain. We run from weakness. We run from anything that reminds us of our own fragility. But the prophet does not just describe how men treat this servant. He describes what God is about to do to him. And the word Isaiah uses next is violent enough to make a translator hesitate. When you read the English translation of Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5, the violence is unmistakable. The text reads, "He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities." We tend to read those words and picture the physical mechanics of a Roman crucifixion. We think of the leather whips, the iron spikes, the slow, agonizing asphyxiation on the wood. We assume the prophet is simply describing what the soldiers did to his body. But the word Isaiah uses here carries a weight that physical, metal, and wood cannot fully explain. The word your Bible translates as crushed is the Hebrew daka. It is a devastating verb. A massive, deliberate crater is left right in the middle of the most important prophetic text of the ancient world. Same omission, same silence. Again and again, it means to crumble, to beat to pieces, to break something down until it is reduced to fine dust. It is the mechanical action of a heavy stone mortar and pestle grinding spices or grains until absolutely nothing of their original shape remains. It is total, structural collapse. The prophet is not just describing physical pain. He is describing a spiritual pulverization. If reading the ancient text at this level of detail is stirring up something inside of you, you're exactly who this channel is for. Drop a thought in the comments and hit subscribe. Because every week we go deeper into the text than you knew was possible. So the prophet uses Daka to describe a soul ground down to powder. But the detail that changes everything is not just what the word means, but who is holding the stone. If you scroll down exactly 5 verses, to Isaiah 53-10, that exact same Hebrew word appears again. But this time, the subject of the sentence shifts. Yet it pleased the Lord to crush him, to Daka him. The Romans did not crush this servant. The political leaders did not crush him. They were merely the physical instruments operating inside a much larger, much older theater of redemption. The crushing came from the hands of the Father himself, pouring out the concentrated, suffocating weight of every human rebellion. Most people assume that when rabbinic scholars look at the Old Testament, they simply hold a different interpretation of the prophecies onto the only shoulders strong enough to bear it. This execution is not a tragedy of history. It is the precise administration of a cure. But when you look at how this shattered servant responds to the weight, the narrative shifts again, and it brings us to a courtroom where the defendant refuses to say a single word. The guards drag him onto the stone pavement. The torches flicker against the cold pillars of the Roman Praetorium. The mob screams for blood in the courtyard below. A Roman governor sits on a marble judgment seat. He leans forward. He states the charges. He asks a question. He waits for a defense. The prisoner says nothing. Isaiah wrote the script for this exact moment, 7 centuries before the Romans even occupied Jerusalem. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted. Yet, he opened not his mouth. Picture the ancient shearing sheds. A lamb is led by a thick rope. A sheep stands on the dusty floor before the shearers. The heavy iron clippers bite into the wool. The fleece falls away. The animal makes no sound. It does not fight the blade. It does not snap at the hands holding it down. Same posture, same stillness. Men stand up in the council and hurl lies. He is silent. Soldiers blindfold him, strike his face with their fists, and demand he prophesy. We assume they have a competing historical model for the Messiah, a different way of connecting the dots. We think it is just an intellectual disagreement. He is silent. A king named Herod mocks him with an elegant robe and hopes for a magic trick. He is silent. A Roman prefect marvels at the absolute absence of panic. He is silent. When a human being is falsely accused, the biological response is immediate. Adrenaline floods the system. The chest tightens. The vocal cords strain to justify, to explain, to fight back. Survival demands a defense. If you are innocent, you scream your innocence to anyone who will listen. This silence is not weakness. It is a weapon. He does not argue with the false witnesses because he is not trying to win an acquittal. The servant does not fight the charges because he is actively accepting the sentence. He is holding back his defense, so the judgment can fall completely on his own shoulders. The prophet watches the scene play out to its brutal end. They drag him away from prison. They march him away from judgment. The heavy iron spikes are driven through the wrists. The cross is dropped into the bedrock. He is cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of the people, he is struck. The executioners finish their work. The lungs empty.